Stanford University.
So very excited that we have here, of course, Bill Draper, Mr. Draper here today. How many of you don't know Bill Draper? How many of you have not read his book?
Hold up the book. You just read the book.
Yeah, books in. Everyone can get it signed after class. So just to give a quick bio about Bill Draper, he's someone who doesn't really need to be introduced, but he attended Yale University where he graduated in 1950. He's perhaps a member of the secret society Skull and Bones. After graduating from college,
I've got to leave.
He served in the Korean War. He attended Harvard Business School, and in 1959, Mr. Draper left Chicago to work as an associate at his father's newly formed venture capital firm, one of the first VC firms in Silicon Valley, and arguably, I guess, the first venture capital firm on the West Coast. Yep. And then in 1962, he left that firm to actually co-found his own venture capital firm called Draper & Johnson Investment Company with his good friend Pitch Johnson. In 1965, got a little bit bored, so started another venture capital firm called Sutter Hill Ventures, which to this day still remains one of the top venture capital firms in the country. He's also served a number of years in government in a number of public service roles. From 1981 to 86, he was president and chairman of the Export and Import Bank and was appointed to the position by President Reagan. He also has served in the UN and was the second highest ranking official there in the United Nations in 1986, so I have a couple of questions about that later as well. And then because he just couldn't do enough, in 2002 he founded the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, which I really admire as one of the top and leading global venture philanthropy funds, so have really seen success both in the for-profit venture space as well as both in social ventures and philanthropy. So format for today's class is, I have a lot of questions because Mr. Draper has had a rich background in terms of the rise of Silicon Valley and Sand Hill Road, some of your experiences in founding VC funds, some of your experiences in government and philanthropy, and then at any point, feel free to interrupt and ask additional questions, but we're going to try to cover at least most of those different topics today, starting with the rise of Silicon Valley and Sand Hill Road. So I guess you joined your father's fund and accepted your first VC position in 1959, and it was the first firm of its type in the West. The company, your father's fund, literally started the Silicon Valley scene when it set up shop right here on Stanford campus, and this was no accident. Can you talk a little bit about the role of Stanford in venture capital and the tech world, and especially as you saw it shape up?
Yeah, Stanford, in 1959, Palo Alto was a little town. There were lots and lots of orchards in Sunnyvale and Mountain View. It was a very laid-back area. And so when we came out here, I was one of 5 young guys to join my father's firm. There was a feeling that this is a sleepy little area, and none of us dreamed that it would become what it has become today, Silicon Valley. And Fred Terman, I think he might have been called, this might be called Terman Valley, because the man was very much a visionary. And he was head of engineering, dean of engineering here at Stanford, and had the realization that, these engineers would create a great product, but if it weren't tied up with some business types, it wouldn't go anywhere and there wouldn't be any value in it. So he had the idea of bringing business people together with some of the great products that were being created here in the engineering department. He later became provost, as some of you know. And so he had the power to raise the budget, and he did it. I went to Yale, and at the same time, a guy who taught me history was elected president of Yale. And one of the worst things he did as president of Yale, the worst, was deciding that engineering is like dentistry. And really, you don't teach dentistry at Yale. You teach biology and chemistry and physics, but not engineering or dentistry. So the budget came way down at Yale. We were about even in 1959, Yale and Stanford, in the engineering departments. So I give Fred Terman a huge amount of credit for leading Stanford into what it is today, the center of research. That somebody here graduated from MIT, and I think even an MIT graduate would agree that Stanford is leading the way in engineering, or at least certainly comparable to the great name of MIT. So that's the first message I had about Stanford and its importance to the area and to the success of Silicon Valley. A few examples. Fred Terman introduced, they both had gone to Stanford, Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard. Hewlett he was the engineer that had the ideas. Packard was working for General Electric at the time and was a businessman, and he put the two of them together, gave them some property. You can't give the property on the Stanford campus, as you know. It's all leased by terms of the will that Leland Stanford made. 9,000 acres is still intact, which is great. And so they leased in a 199-year lease the property to Hewlett and Packard. And that was kind of the beginning. That was back in just as the war was breaking out in 1940. So anyway, we came in 1959 as the first venture capital company, and we were given the same small plot of 1 acre, I suppose, on Welch Road here in Welch Road. I hated the name Welch Road because you shake hands on a deal, in the venture world, and a deal is a deal, and your word is as good as your honor, and the honor is as good as your word. And Welch Road is not really we didn't want to welch on any deals, but anyway, we started on Welch Road, and Draper, Gaither and Anderson was the very first venture capital company in the West. The Anderson had run the 8th Bomber Command out of London during the war and bombed Berlin. There was a movie about him and about that whole effort called 12 O'Clock High. And some hotshot movie star played his part. Anyway, they worked together at Averell Harriman's suggestion, because my father was running the Marshall Plan in Paris, and Harriman said, you ought to have a deputy, and I got an idea, and that's this man Anderson. And anyway, the two of them worked together for about 3-4 years in Paris, running the Marshall Plan, and then they decided to come west, and they both knew something about. My father had been an investment banker, and he had helped do. His firm was picked to help finance or lead the financing of the Oakland Bay Bridge. So he knew Northern California, and Anderson did too, because he had been up at Travis Air Force Base north of here, and they both knew the weather was good, and this would be a good place to start a venture capital company. And there were what was called special situations at the time, and they would just back these little special situations. It wasn't called venture capital. My wife had to explain to her friends, what I was doing, and she couldn't quite explain it, and they didn't quite understand it, but in any event. And we would go ahead.
Yeah, well, I guess on that note, can you talk a little bit about deal flow in terms of how exactly did you get deal flow? Like, no one knew exactly what venture capital was.
At Draper, Gaither and Anderson, we got an article written about us in Business Week, and the word was kind of out that we were a company that helped businesses with equity rather than, there was the Bank of America and Wells Fargo in San Francisco, but that was, they didn't give a grant, they didn't put equity in, they only put in debt. And little companies shouldn't borrow, they should just have equity. So anyway, that started in that way, and we were we were a very kind of a laid-back operation, but deals. The phone did ring, and things happened there because we were novel, and we had an article written about us. When I started my own company with Pitch Johnson, you know, we sat also on Welch Road on the other side, and we'd see cars coming into Draper, Gaither, and Anderson, and by the way, the Anderson in that was a lawyer here in San Francisco, a very brilliant man who had been head of the Ford Foundation, president of the Ford Foundation, chairman of the Rand Corporation, and managing partner of the great law firm, which is now Cooley in San Francisco, but it was Cooley, Crowley, Gaither. And he died at the age of 50 after doing all those things. And he was a great guy. So anyway, when I left to start my own firm 3 years later with Pitch, who was a Stanford graduate, by the way, we each rented a blue Pontiac, and we thought we'd keep the colors of the firm blue. And we each went out in various parts of what is now Silicon Valley, go down to Sunnyvale and San Jose and so on, knock on a door that was a barn that might say something electronics on it. And we'd go in, and the receptionist would say, well, what do you want to do? Well, we'd like to see the president. Well, what firm are you with? Well, we're with a venture capital company. And she'd kind of give us a queer look, and then the president would come out, and he's a small company, and would be happy to meet us, except when we said venture capital, he would go and give us the same look. And so then we had to explain that we give away money and we buy just a small part of the company's stock. He said, well, come on in. And we spent morning and afternoon, day after day doing this, and we got to be known pretty well as a place to go by the people, the financial people in San Francisco. They'd call us and say, well, what's that ABC company? Well, we knew about it, and it was because a little hard work and a lot of fun and a lot of wasted mornings and afternoons. Yes?
I was just going to ask quickly, when did you see that shift? Because it seems when did you see the shift from you going out and reaching out to all these people to them coming to you? Like, how long did that take?
Well, right, it took about 5 minutes to figure out that nobody's coming to see you, because we were up in a second floor building, and we'd look out. We had a big window, and we were in one room office, and both our desks looked down on Welch Road, and every so often one of our wives would come by and honk the horn, and we'd wave, and that's the most action we got in those first few weeks. But anyway, it was right away. We had to get going, so we got these cars and moved out.
So I guess a follow-up question to that, when do you think founders really started to understand venture capital exists, you can take money from investors, and you didn't have to actually go out and explain to founders what VC was?
Well, it built up gradually. We began to make some pretty good deals, and then Arthur Rock, a little later in San Francisco, who had backed, because he was with an investment firm in New York, and he had backed, before he came out here, a small electronic company that ended up owning Intel. And so he was in the city, and then there were one or two other companies that came along, and I would say it was 3 years after we had gotten started in art. But again, Draper, Gaither, and Anderson was getting better known, and we were getting known, and so then eventually Sequoia came, and Kleiner Perkins, and we began to work with them. And I can tell you that later.
Okay. So in 1965, 3 years after you started Draper and Johnson, you started Sutter Hill Ventures and started it as an evergreen fund, which I think is still a very novel concept. Can you talk a little bit about how you thought about that? And
yeah, it shouldn't be novel at this point, but you're right. And the reason is, okay, the evergreen fund, just to explain it, is every 4 years we would value the portfolio, and if anybody wanted to get out, they could sell their stock at their investment, their limited partnership in the firm, in Sutter Hill Ventures, which is still here in Palo Alto, as you point out, and they still do it the same way. And the benefit is that the general partners and the limited partners are on the same page. It's all the same. Today, Sutter Hill, when they make an investment, more than half, often, of the money comes from the individuals that have the general partners that have been running it. Whereas the other firms, every other firm, is in a different way. What they do is start a fund, and people put in the fund, limited partners put in 80%, they put in all the money, and they get, let's say, 80 to 85 80% of the deal, or 75% of the deal, and the limited partners get the balance. And the limited partners insist on that today because they don't trust the general partners to value it properly. But when I left Sutter Hill to go to public service, it was easy. I had my choice. I could either take the cash of that valuation or take pieces of the companies that we were in. And I took the pieces of the company because I thought, they'll grow, and I knew about them and so on. But anyway, limited partners don't like that, except the limited partners in Sutter Hill, who are all the same. Well, there was a company called Genstar, Canadian company, that backed us, that put the first $10 million into our firm and got us started at Sutter Hill. And they eventually, American Tobacco took a big Canadian holding company, and American Tobacco took over that company and didn't like venture capital, so they wanted to get rid of it. So they got rid of it, but the ones that knew what we were doing were Princeton, Yale, Stanford, and I don't think Harvard. But the three of them all grabbed at the chance to buy the stock of Genstar, and they've been that way. They've been in that ever since. Nobody's talking about getting out, but if they wanted to get out, they'd get out on a fair basis, as they say.
So you've founded, obviously, a number of firms. So we mentioned Draper and Johnson, Sutter Hill Ventures, also Draper Richards Kaplan. Also founded it with, Robin Richards, a Stanford GSB student at the time. How do you evaluate partners to work with in terms of partners to co-found these firms with? How do you actually, and I know you touch upon that a little bit in your book, but how do you just evaluate individuals to work with?
You're talking about the partners that I would have in the firm, like Robin or Pitch.
Yeah.
Pitch I knew at Inland Steel. We both worked in Chicago in a little, we worked in this little town called East Chicago, Indiana, and it had an oil refinery, a cement plant, and a steel factory, and all the dirt from all of those. Oh, and a coke oven and a steel factory. So all that junk came down on his car and mine, and we'd wash the cars on Saturday, and we'd have to wash it again on Sunday. It was a dirty town, and a great place to bring up my wife. That was our first job, my first job, and she has never complained since, particularly here. So we met there at Inland Steel. He worked in the steel mill. He said, "Draper, you're not really a steel man. You just sold the stuff, but I am, a real guy. I worked in the open hearth and all this." So we built a good relationship there because our families grew up for about 3 years together in East Chicago. So I got to know him, and I knew he was bright, had a great education here at Stanford, was hardworking, and not afraid to roll up his sleeves, and a great warm personality. Mm-hmm. In the case of Robin Richards, I met her when I came back from public service, and I was kind of, watching the grass grow for a while, wondering what to do. But I knew I knew I wanted to go to Asia with start a venture capital firm in Asia somewhere, because I knew from the Export-Import Bank and from the UN experience that Asia was really growing, and it didn't have any venture capital operations. And when I went to visit those places in Asia, I could see that this would be a good thing to do. She was so then a friend of mine said, "Well, I would come to Stanford tonight, because this gal is getting credit for a study for me of Peru, I think it was, and I was thinking of doing some investing in Peru, so it might be interesting." So I went, and she didn't say much. She had pulled this group together. They all got credit for the effort. They had fun doing it, and there were about 4 or 5 of them that worked together. Well, this was Stanford Business School, second year. And so I went back, didn't think too much more about it, except I got an email from her. No, sorry, there were no emails. No email. I got a fax. And the fax said, "Let's talk about venture capital. I'd like to visit with you about venture capital." So we met the next Saturday for breakfast, and the breakfast went for about 3 hours. And I put together, you're asking me why did I think? Mm-hmm. And I thought, here's a girl from Atlanta with a warm, southern, charming personality. Here's a girl that asked me a lot of questions during that luncheon, during the breakfast, so she was curious, and that's a very important trait in a venture capitalist. Here's a woman who had the initiative to fax me and not just let it go. She knew I had some experience in the venture world before with Draper, Gaither and Anderson, and starting in Sutter Hill. So she had the initiative to do something, and she had the initiative to pull all those people together. She had the initiative to get credit for it, not just do it out of the kindness of her heart. And she was Phi Beta Kappa, and a lovely person, still one of my very closest friends. It was an easy choice, and I knew before the end of the breakfast, that I wanted her to be a partner. She knew she wanted to be a partner with me, and we had a deal. She knew how much stock how much of the company she was going to get, and we had a deal within a 3-hour breakfast. So it doesn't take long to size up brain power, education, warmth of personality, curiosity, and general strength of character, which you can sort of size up after a good conversation.
So if you have a venture capital fund idea, or just any fund idea that you want to be Mr. Draper's next fund, send him a fax, right?
Send me a fax. Yeah, I still do have a fax machine, but it's blinking on and off. And frankly, I don't know if it'll get through. I do have an email now, believe it.
Oh, or email. So, okay, so on the topic
Bill at
of
Draper Richards.
on the topic of Draper International, I think Draper International also pioneered a whole new type of venture capital business in terms of being internationally focused, and you initially first focused on India, and I think the firm was instrumental in helping to kickstart India's tech scene and really kind of building the economy there. How did you know that India as a country and the region was ready for such a firm to come in and jumpstart things? And I guess because there's also a lot of international students in the class. Why India?
Right. So the day after she graduated from Stanford Business School, we were on a plane to China. And as I told you, I knew I wanted to go to Asia, but I wasn't sure what country. And the two of us went to China and we met up with somebody who would have been our partner there. We went to Vietnam. We went to Indonesia and one other country. We didn't go to India. Both of us had been to India, and we didn't even, we didn't talk much about India. We were checking out all these countries. We only wanted to do this in one country. And so we went to, came back to San Francisco, and we decided on India. And you ask, well, why? There were a few people. There were a few people here, a guy named Conwell Recchi and 2 or 3 others, who were Indian and living in the valley and doing something technical or involved in some way in startup sort of situations. So we had known a little bit of a few Indians. The main reason, we never had to go to Asia. The main reason we decided on India was big, complicated country, and that was we wanted, and that was true of China and lots of other. But they spoke English. And when we realized that, we said, that's the place for us, because we would have lost all our money in China, I'm sure. Working through an interpreter, trying to make private deals, we would have just not done well. So that's the honest truth. I mean, it's sort of embarrassing to tell you that because it's kind of stupid. We did all this touring around, but we had fun doing it, by the way. That wasn't any problem, but it wasn't all that. It just cemented the idea that we really ought to have an English-speaking country, and India was the big one, the interesting one. We knew some Indians here in the valley, and it worked out very well. We made 16 times the limited partners' money in 6 years.
Wow, that's a good return. So
we were first. That's a good message for all of you. Don't be, when you decide to do something, don't be a Me Too operator. Don't say, I want to go there because that's where everybody's going, because that means competition. We went to India, and we were the very first venture capital company, cross-border with the US, there was. And so we got all the deals. They all came to us, just like Draper, Gaither, and Anderson got a lot of flow, and being second isn't so good.
Question in the back?
Yeah, just wanted to follow up on this internationalization point. So I'm wondering, besides language barriers, are there any other pitfalls in investing in foreign countries, particularly like developing countries? And also, what changed?
So I guess question is in investing in foreign countries, what are other pitfalls besides language barriers?
Good question. First of all, you're kind of naked out there. There's nothing. You don't know anybody. You're new to the country. You don't know some of the way in which they speak. They might mean, like the Indians. You ask a question, and we found that not to get all concerned just because they're going. When you ask the question, you can't tell whether they're nodding their head or they're shaking their head, and that seems to be a trait that's real. I mean, there are probably a couple of Indians here who know what I'm talking about. But in any event, there are certain cultural things that you've got to learn. So you've got to get up to speed, and it is a little dangerous, but it's not a very hard thing to do. If you're first, a lot of people try and help you, actually, which is a good thing. But if you're first, as I say, you're likely to get the publicity, the deal flow, and you're bound to make a few mistakes, but you have to just accept that and keep going. But it really worked for us. We had a great time in India, and we'd go on a Sunday, and we'd work for 5 days, Monday through Friday, and then on the weekend, we would go to a part of India that we had never been to. That was part of we just figured we're going to really get acquainted with this country. And we'd spend a weekend in some remote place. So we've been to a lot of places that many Indians haven't been. And then we come back and work from Monday through Friday and come home again. So we'd always do a 2 weeks deal, and we had a couple of very good partners, one in Mumbai and one in Bangalore, and they were Indians who we had selected to help tee up our deals, so that when we go there, we'd have a full plate to work on.
Mm-hmm. So on the topic of kind of international investing, so your son...
I keep backing up further, but there is an end to this.
We'll go closer up. So your son founded a firm, Draper, Fisher, Jurgensen, DFJ, which developed the DFJ network, which is kind of this network of independent venture capital firms around the world.
Draper, Fisher, Jurgensen.
Mm-hmm. And then I think that model has changed again, but can you describe kind of this innovative system that DFJ spurred, which was all these different independent firms that were still tied back to?
To be perfectly honest, I don't fully understand. Mm-hmm. You're talking about the distribution mm-hmm. in different countries yep. of different, and kind of a network, mm-hmm. a VC network. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tim started that, and I really don't know much about it, but mm-hmm. It is not perfect because they're having some communication mm-hmm. problems and so on. But the idea of it is to have a solid firm in Silicon Valley, and then to pick an entrepreneurial venture capitalist in, say, Paris, and another one in Rome, and another one in Beijing, and then let them build up a 2 or 3, but make it a network that communicates with each other and shares opportunities. The one in London hears about something in Germany, they connect in, and I think it's, as I say, it's got some warts, but it's working along, I think. Mm-hmm. That's about all I know about it. I really don't know too much about it.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Draper legacy in a little bit, but for now, can we talk a little bit about your work in public service and philanthropy? Specifically, you were appointed as by Vice President George Bush to head up the Export-Import Bank, and then after that, serve as Secretary General of the United Nations, which is the second highest position there. Can you talk a little bit about how you're
Undersecretary General?
It all sounds nice.
There are quite a few Undersecretary Generals, but whoever runs the United Nations Development Program, the social good thing, which I did, is considered the coordinator and the senior member, and therefore the number 2 in the. He's no longer, by the way, and it's a she. I mean, it's the former Prime Minister of New Zealand that's running it now. But she is no longer the number 2 because now they have a Deputy Secretary General. They did, when I was there, I was the senior person and therefore ranked. And anybody want to guess how much more I got than every other Secretary General, every other Undersecretary General? I got $50 more per year than everybody else. So it was a minor thing that I was considered the number 2 because I had a job that they, and by the way, but it was a coordinating job, and that was the rationale. UNDP, I might tell everybody, you know, and I had never heard of it when I was asked to take the job, but it turned out to be one of the best I've ever done. And that's a message I have for all of you, which is say yes a lot more than you say no. And when you get an opportunity to do something, don't brush it off too fast. Be sure you study the implications and the possibilities. Anyway, this job, which I had knew nothing about, I knew nothing about the UN, turned out to be a wonderful job. I got to 101 developing countries. It was an aid job for these countries, and we had projects, 20 or 15 or 30 projects in each country, and a resident representative who ran it from that country, but then on a certain size deal, it would come to New York. And I got to 101 developing countries. Just that by itself was a hell of an education. I raised money from the rich countries, there were 9 of them, and I would go knock on doors and plead for money with a little tin cup. And they'd, you know, these various rich countries would have a different system for taking care of developing countries. Like we have USAID, and each one has something similar to that. And so I felt like Robin Hood. I went from the rich to the poor, and had a terrific time anyway. And a great, wonderful group of people. The UN gets a bad rap. You know, it isn't, for example, Burkina Faso, the UN is made up of 3 parts, basically. One is the General Assembly, where every country can talk to every other country. And so Burkina Faso can be in the General Assembly, make a speech, and when they speak, maybe they say, hey, the United States is just terrible and they're not doing things right. And in Ohio and here, we all think, I mean, the average citizen thinks that's the UN talking to us, and therefore that's not popular and it's bad PR, but it basically is every country's right to talk about any subject about to all the other countries in the room and any publicity outside. So that's the General Assembly. Then there is the Security Council, which is just the very strongest countries are a part of that, except it was built after World War II, right on the heels of World War II. So Japan and Germany are not on it. They should be. About now, pretty soon, they'll probably get to be on it, but but it's only England, France, the United States, and Russia. And those countries are the permanent members, and they have veto power. And then there are, I don't know, 3 other countries that rotate, 3 other spots that rotate among all the other countries. So that's the Security Council, and the job there is to maintain security around the world. So that the state system, so-called, which is, you know, everybody's got boundaries, and the boundaries are protected by the Security Council, so that when North Korea attacks South Korea, the UN Security Council took on the job of, we're going to fight them and push them back, and we'll get you, the United States, to lead it. But it was Turkey and lots of other countries, England and lots of others that participated in that war. I fought in that war, as a matter of fact. So I know it firsthand. But I was fighting under a UN flag, not an American flag, when we pushed North Korea back to the 38th parallel. So and in Iraq, the same thing. You know, when they invaded Kuwait, same thing. And so that's the Security Council. And the third part is the part I was a part of, which is all of the social good programs, UNICEF, an environmental program, the World Food Program, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations Development Program, which, as I say, was a coordinator.
So I guess, why did you decide to go into public service and philanthropy after a career in venture capital, and how did your career in venture capital help shape and help you and benefit you in public service?
Okay, probably my father had been very active in both, not only in venture, he wasn't that active in venture capital. He had a career that was very thorough and had completed a lot of things in the investment banking world and also in public service. And probably he was my inspiration to go work in Washington when they asked me, when Reagan was elected. And I had worked for George Bush, who against Reagan, as a matter of fact, but Bush was given some slots, I guess, and in Washington, and asked me or it was actually Reagan's the personnel operation that asked me to come back and take over the Export-Import Bank of the U.S. But I think it was my father probably so again, back to you guys. Say yes more than, so here's a change, a big change. I've been in the venture capital business all my life, done very well. Sutter Hill was booming, and I walked away from a lot of money. I mean, I got the stocks that we had done in there, but it's gone on, and those guys that had stayed around are a lot richer than I am. But that's another message. Money is very helpful, and I would not suggest you ignore it. I would be happy to take any money that comes your way, but I also recommend that you think your life is pretty short. Your time is really much more valuable probably than the money. Go for it. Go for the risk. Go for something that's far out, because you'll have a great experience. You can always back out of it and do something else. I mean, don't do anything that's going to get you in jail. I don't think that. But do things that are fun, look like they'll be interesting, and have a real purpose. And the other piece of advice I have, and you know, you wanted to ask me some advice at the end of this, and it's getting pretty close. Don't try to, I have a 13-year-old that lives with us, and his He's a wonderful kid, Filipino background. And he's my best friend. He's been with us for 10 or 11 years. And his mother, the reason is my wife has Parkinson's, and we need a registered nurse around, and this is her son. And he's been with us most of his life. He says, well, I'll just tell you a quick story. His mother was called by a minister in a church near us in Menlo Park that Paolo is here and talking to a policeman, and I think you better come. So of course she goes like this and goes there to see what's. Well, the policeman said no, I'm talking to him, but it's the other two kids that spray painted the wall of the church, and with a spray gun, and his friends, but he didn't do it, and so she was delighted. And so when he got back home, I said, Paolo, how on earth did you avoid all that social pressure? Because he's artistic. You would have loved that spray. He said, Pops, on the one hand, I had the spray can, and it was very tempting. But on the other hand was Yale University. That was his answer. But my message to you guys is he has been talking about going to Yale, and he's planning his whole life to get to Yale, and it helped in that situation for sure. But don't try to figure your life out too much ahead of time. People graduate from Stanford, or they change after their first job and wonder, what should I do for the rest of my life? Well, you're not going to probably do the same thing for the rest of your life, so relax and take your chances and have some fun. And I think, are we wound up?
Yep, that's good advice to conclude. Thank you.
I love you guys. I love you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.